Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for coming to this UNE Business School seminar. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land that we call New England and show respect to the elders past, present, and emerging of these nations. Today we have Mathew Frith, who is PhD candidate at Federation University, Australia, and holds a Bachelor of Economics with first-class honor from our school. It's good to have you back. His doctoral dissertation is currently under examination and is about the topic that he will review today about the American protectionist thought. And he is also working as casual academic at the UNE Business School and is a member of the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia. So thank you, Mathew, for coming and for sharing this very interesting and up-to-date topic with the protectionism. Thank you. Here I want to give you this.
Okay. We got all that there. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming along to my talk today. And I'd especially like to thank Emilio for the introduction and organising today's seminar and allowing me to present. I'd likewise like to thank Andrea Wallace for her suggestion that I present this seminar. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge my doctoral supervisors, Jerry Corsanis, Alexander Milmo, Jeremy Smith, and the late John Pullen. It's good to be here today, even though I completed my dissertation via Federation University, Australia. As Emilio mentioned, I did complete my Bachelor of Economics and my honours program here at UNE, and I have maintained an affiliation with the UNE Business School. Now, the topic of today's seminar, which is the theory of individuality in American protectionist thought, isn't actually the topic of my dissertation, but it does represent an important element contained within it. So just some background information. My dissertation is entitled American Protectionist Thought, the Economic Philosophy and Theory of the 19th Century American Protectionists. Basically, I attempted to draw upon the full corpus of American protectionist literature. By that, I mean the primary sources written by the American protectionists themselves. And I identified roughly 70 economists that made up this particular school of thought. So it was actually quite a large school of thought. And then I distilled the ideas from their works and reconstructed their system of thought. So that's what my thesis does. So this is actually a list of the 70 different economists which makes up the school. So this is actually taken from the context of my appendix, and I provide a biographical sketch on each of these economists in the appendix. Now, if you take a look at my contents page, which is provided on this slide, these economists wrote on all the major areas of economic analysis. They weren't just advocates of the infant industry argument. They were indeed systematic thinkers on political economy. So starting with chapter 7, you start off with the theoretical foundations. They had their own theory of value, their own theory of growth, development, and entrepreneurship, their own theory of distribution and social mobility, their own theory of population and agglomeration, their own theory of the business cycle, and of course their own theory of international trade, as well as their own analysis of taxation. So they have a complete and distinct system of economic thought. But today I'm mainly focusing on one of the axioms of American protectionist thought, which is found in chapter 7. So here's the contents of chapter 7. So I'm just focusing on section 7.3, which is individuality and the nature of man. Before getting into that, however, it's probably important to give a background to the school of thought itself so we know exactly what we're talking about. So the school of thought is the American Protectionist School. It existed from around 1790 to about the 1920s. The school emerged with the ideas of Alexander Hamilton and his contemporaries. So Alexander Hamilton was the first US Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. And during this time, he produced the Report on Manufactures, which can be viewed as the founding document of this particular school of thought. Now, Hamilton wasn't the only founder of the school. I'll come back to this in a later slide, but there were actually two other founders which I identified throughout the course of this study. So the school advocated what is known as the American system of capitalism. As the name of the school suggests, the first plank of this system is protective tariffs. The second plank is infrastructure, or what they used to call internal improvements. In fact, they saw tariffs and infrastructure as actually complementary in nature. Tariffs were used for the protection of industry, but they were also designed for the collection of revenue. Then this revenue would be used to fund the construction of infrastructure and also to fund the general operations of the government. Now, contrary to what one might expect, the third plank of their system is actually support for free internal markets and low levels of taxation domestically. So the idea is that your economy is protected from foreign competition, but within the domestic market, there's limited regulation and limited taxation. Of course, the exception to that is the infrastructure plank. So even though there was a significant role for the state in creating conditions conducive to entrepreneurship and the expansion of private enterprise, they were also very explicit in setting limits on the role of government. And so the scope of government involvement was clearly defined in this school of thought. So finally, the school of thought was aligned with the Federalist, Whig and Republican parties. So there's a lineage here. It's a bit of a simplification, but the Federalists, which was actually Alexander Hamilton's own party, they eventually evolved into the Whig Party, and then the Whig Party later became the Republican Party. And what you find is that many of the Whig and Republican statesmen, so different congressmen and Republican presidents, they were actually advised by members of this school of thought. And a lot of the members of the school of thought were members of the party, of these parties. And this explains why the American system was actually Whig and Republican policy. Sure, come in. So this affinity between the American Protectionists and the Federalist, Whig and Republican parties explains why during the late 19th and early 20th century, it was actually Republican Whig policy. I'll just... So I argue in my dissertation that the American Protectionists represent a distinct, unique and systematic school of economic thought, but this is not how the school is conventionally understood. Instead, the school is largely depicted as unoriginal and having added nothing to economic theory. The standard interpretation is that they were simply adapting classical economics to divergent policy objectives. So this treatment begins with Charles Franklin Dunbar, and I have a quote from him. He's the first one up there. So he was the first economist to really write a history of American economic thought. And according to Dunbar, the general result then to which, as we believe, a sober examination of the case may lead any candid inquirer is that the United States have thus far done nothing towards developing the theory of political economy, notwithstanding their vast immediate interest in practical applications. Following Dunbar, there was Hugo Rabano, and he stated that in the crowd of American protectionist writers, rarely indeed is originality to be met with, and mere commonplace abounds. Now, one of the more perplexing cases is that given by Joseph Schumpeter, who explains that the opinion that Dunbar expressed in 1876, namely that the American literature had contributed nothing towards developing the theory of political economy, has not been invalidated by information made available by more recent research. Now, this is a side issue, but anyone who knows Schumpeter knows that Schumpeter's contribution to economics relates to dynamic economic change resulting from technology. This emphasis is actually very similar to the American protectionist writers. The American protectionist theory of growth and development centers on the role of innovation, technological change, and entrepreneurship. And they were writing roughly a century prior to Schumpeter. It seems to me that Schumpeter never actually read the works of the American protectionists. I think he was just reiterating what the secondary literature had to say, because I think if he would have actually read it, he would have been quite receptive to what they had to say. So this dismissal of the American protectionists as unoriginal and derivative of classical economics has continued in more modern texts. So Paul K. Conkin wrote, "I've been unable to identify in the pre-Civil War period anything close to a distinctive American tradition in political economy. The early American economists inherited from Europe an array of technical arguments, which they adapted to quite divergent policy implications." Then John Kenneth Galbraith likewise affirmed that it was from Ricardo, Mill and Marshall that American economic ideas were derived. These ideas were written by Americans into textbooks and enlarged and amended as to detail. But in the last century, not much was added by American theorists. And this was also reiterated by William J. Barber, who explains that American political economy had been heavily import dependent, even though foreign ideas were altered to adjust their fit to the circumstances of the New World. Now, there are numerous other secondary sources which keep repeating this same message. In short, the secondary literature describes the American protectionism as merely an adaptation of classical economics to divergent policy objectives. In terms of theory, there was nothing distinct or original about the American protectionists. In fact, what you get if you kind of take the secondary literature is that the school of thought doesn't really actually exist. It's just a adaptation of classical economics. Now, I've read the primary sources of the American protectionists, and quite frankly, I find this a very bizarre assessment. Not only did the American protectionists develop their own distinct theoretical system, the American protectionists diverged from the classicals to a far greater extent on theory than what they did on policy. Now, this is not to prove that the American protectionists agreed with the classicals on everything when it came to policy. The American system is a distinct policy program unique to the American protectionists, and the classicals didn't look too fondly upon the American system. With that said, what you get in the existing literature is the view that the protectionists fundamentally agreed with the classicals on theory, but happened to arrive at very different policy conclusions. The biggest divergence between the classicals and the protectionists was not on policy. The American protectionists and the classicals largely agreed on policy fundamentals, even though they differed quite substantially in terms of policy details. Yet, when it comes to economic theory, the American protectionists did not agree with the classicals on the fundamentals. They differed on the very axioms which underpin the two economic systems. And one of the biggest divergences, which is the topic of today's discussion, is their conception of the individual. But before I do that, I'll just run through the fundamentals which both the schools shared in terms of policy. So first, both schools were committed to protecting private property rights. In fact, I think it can be argued that the American protectionists were far more consistent than the classicals on the issue of private property rights. Whereas many classicals had a problem with landlords and land ownership, the American protectionists treated land as a form of capital and defended land ownership on that basis. So that's actually another area where the American protectionists differed from the classicals in terms of in terms of theory. Both schools supported the enforcement of contracts, rule of law, a functioning court system, those sorts of things. And although they differed in terms of details, both largely supported the idea of free markets and prescribed limits on the role of government. This is not to say, of course, that they supported no government. Both schools supported a role for government, but both agreed that this role should be clearly defined and that production should be carried out by private producers on the market. This isn't so much a fundamental as such, but it does give you a sense of how both schools conceived the role of government, and that is the fact that both schools rejected what is now called Keynesian macroeconomic policy. It might seem anachronistic to actually use that term because Keynesian economics didn't exist at the time, but there were various proto-Keynesians called underconsumptionists that did advocate those policies prior to Keynes. Both the classicals and the protectionists rejected these sorts of policies. And interestingly, they actually had two different theories of the business cycle, but they happened to arrive at the same conclusion. Now, just because they agreed on these fundamentals doesn't mean they agreed on everything. The American system is a distinct system unique to the American protectionists, and there are significant points of departure. But these points of departure are more in terms of details. So, of course, the American protectionists endorsed protective tariffs, whereas the classicals supported free trade. They were generally more pro-infrastructure than the classicals. The American protectionists placed more emphasis on internal free markets and low levels of internal taxation, whereas the classicals, they tolerated internal taxation in order to allow free trade. The idea of the American protectionists was you can have these customs duties and that will also eliminate the need for domestic taxation. So there's a difference there. In particular, the American protectionists were overwhelmingly hostile to income tax and other forms of direct taxation. With the classicals, it's not so clear. You had some classicals which were in favour of consumption taxes. So the American protectionists argued that if you're going to have taxes, it should be consumption taxes and in particular tariffs. The classicals rejected tariffs, but some did support consumption taxes, but others did support income tax. And in particular, a lot of them supported taxation on land and land rents. So there's a bit of difference in details there. So even though there are these differences in terms of policy, I maintain that after examining and comparing their theoretical systems, there is a more convincing case to be made that the protectionists diverged more significantly on theory than they did on policy relative to the classicals. On policy, they largely agreed on the fundamentals, but when it came to theory, they differed on basic assumptions and axioms. And perhaps nowhere is this better demonstrated than in their conception of the individual. And economics as a science deals with how individuals in society organise production, distribution and exchange. So arguably there's nothing more fundamental and axiomatic in economics than how the individual is conceived. So let's begin with the classical conception of the individual as laid down by Adam Smith, who is commonly seen as the father of classical economics. So according to Adam Smith, the difference of natural talents in different men is in reality much less than we are aware of. And the very different genius which appears to distinguish men of different professions when grown up to maturity is not on many occasions so much the cause as the effect of the division of labour. The difference between the most similar characters between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much from nature. So here you have Adam Smith denying or at least downplaying the fact that there are natural differences among individuals. He sees the individual as more or less homogeneous and uniform. In fact, many scholars, so I'm not the only one that has made this observation, many scholars have argued that Smith was a proponent of the blank slate theory of human nature, which basically argues that individual differences arise from different experiences. There's nothing really inherently different between different individuals. Now, this depiction of man as homogeneous and uniform only sped up under David Ricardo. With Adam Smith, there was at least some recognition of individual differences due to individuals having different experiences, but nonetheless, there was nothing fundamental or inherent about it. This is even less the case with Ricardo. To quote Ricardo, it'll be of little importance to examine the comparative degree of estimation of the relative productiveness in which different kinds of labour are held. The variation is very inconsiderable. Now, Ricardo is a very difficult writer if anyone's looked at his work, so this passage doesn't really capture the Ricardian treatment of individuals or labour. What you get in the Ricardian system is that labour is depicted in highly abstract terms and is treated as an undifferentiated input in the production process. So basically in the Ricardian system, a unit of labour is a unit of labour. Now, arguably, Ricardo had noble reasons to do this, regardless of what your opinion is of Ricardo. Virtually all historians of economic thought would agree that Ricardo was the first economist to attempt to make economics into a science. But in attempting to formulate a scientific model of the economy, Ricardo developed an exceedingly abstract system of economic relations which left no room for individual differences. Now, the American protectionists weren't against system building. They actually agreed with the classicals that economics could be treated as a science, but they rejected the abstract model building of Ricardo. I should stress, by the way, that I'm not trying to disparage the classicals here. I think we should study the history of economic thought, and I think there is a lot of value to be had in reading the works of the classical economists. But I think it's also important to look at lesser known schools of thought outside of the mainstream, such as the one being discussed today. Now, in contrast to the classical tradition of Smith and Ricardo, the American protectionists viewed man as possessing natural differences. So the following quote is from Henry Charles Carey, who was the leader of the school in the mid-19th century. So whereas Smith downplays natural differences among individuals, Henry Carey explains that the distinctive feature of man is individuality. Each rat or robin, fox or wolf is a type of his species wherever found, possessing habits and instincts in common. But such is not the case with man, in whom we find differences in tastes, feelings and capacities almost as numerous as those observed in human countenance. So a very different view of man to that of the classical economists. Man indeed possesses a high degree of individuality. There are natural differences in tastes, abilities, talents, aptitudes and so forth. And this is something that is distinct and inherent in man. Now, this was not an isolated view. It was a view shared by virtually every member of the school. And this will be demonstrated over the coming slides. Now, to really contrast the difference in the approach between the classicals and the American protectionists, it's good to look at the example of individual genius. Happen there? If we recall from earlier, Adam Smith denied the existence of natural genius, suggesting that it was purely the product of the division of labour. In contrast to Smith, we have the following quote from John Ray, who in my view is perhaps the most sophisticated economist in history, but that's just my opinion. So according to Ray, genius is by many considered synonymous with learning. A refined and cultivated mind does not properly constitute genius, but it consists in a gift of nature. Education may embellish the mind, but there is something noble and majestic in a great natural genius. There is something divine in a true genius that raises the soul above itself and enables it to obtain objects beyond the sphere of intellect. So a very radically different conception of genius compared to Adam Smith. And the protectionists were also explicit in calling out the Ricardian tendency of treating labour as an abstract and undifferentiated input in the production process. So we have Alexander Hill Everett, who explains that the labour of the individual is by no means a fixed quantity, but varies with their natural dispositions and with the motives that determine their conduct. We observe a remarkable difference in the activity and industry of different communities and of different persons in the same community, resulting from varieties of situation and character. I should clarify that in this example, he's not actually responding to Ricardo, he's actually responding to Robert Thomas Malthus, who's another classical who wrote on population. But Malthus did have a very similar method to Ricardo, and he's calling that out there. However, Francis Bowen did explicitly call out Ricardo, explaining that the great mistake of Ricardo and his followers, who have done so much to reduce political economy to a mere deductive science, all the conclusions in which are obtained by abstract reasoning with a few arbitrary premises. This, that they generally treat of labour in the abstract and make no allowance for the differences in the quality of labour. Now, this is just an example I picked. There are numerous other cases of the American protectionists going after Ricardo on this basis. At any rate, we have a repudiation of both the Smithian and the Ricardian treatment of the individual among the protectionist writers. Now, as mentioned previously, Hamilton wasn't the only father of this particular school of thought. I actually identified 3 in my study. In addition to Hamilton, we had Tench Coxe and William Barton. All 3 of these thinkers knew each other. Tench Coxe was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Hamilton. He was also the first economist to write a full book-sized treatise on political economy. And what a lot of people don't realise is that Tench Coxe was actually the co-author of the report on manufactures. William Barton also served in the Treasury Department under Hamilton and Coxe. He worked as Chief Clerk of the Treasury. There isn't any direct evidence that Barton helped to write the report on manufactures, but it wouldn't surprise me if he influenced it in some way, as many of the arguments featured in Barton's earlier writings actually made it into the report on manufactures. In any event, what you find is that all 3 founding members of the school affirm this view of mankind. So Hamilton explains that there is a diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from one another. Cox explains that when the variety of human talent is duly remembered, there are those who have been peculiarly qualified by nature for the useful arts, and we should find encouragement necessary to call forth their various talents. And Barton also explains that within each nation, a variety of genius, habits and manners exists among each of their respective inhabitants. You may have noticed that Cox's quote comes from a draft on the report on manufactures. I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that Hamilton was therefore influenced by Cox, because there is actually an earlier draft of the report on manufactures which express the same idea. With that said, both of the passages are actually quite distinct. So it seems to me that it was actually a dialogue between the two economists, or potentially the three economists, and that's where this idea emerged. But that's really a side issue. What is evident is that this theory of individuality was a feature of the school since its very conception. Now, this is just a quick summary and comparison of the views. The classical approach treats individuals as basically homogeneous and uniform factors of production and depicts labour as an undifferentiated input in the production process. The American Protectionist, on the other hand, stresses the importance of individuality, with individuals possessing unique talents, aptitudes and dispositions. Now, this fundamental difference would lead to very profound differences in the two theoretical systems between the two schools. So let's look into how this led to a different analysis of economic phenomenon. First, both schools had a different understanding of the division of labour. In the case of Adam Smith, he held that individual differences are the result of the division of labour as opposed to the cause of the division of labour. So where does the division of labour come from, according to Adam Smith? Well, Adam Smith argues that it's due to a certain propensity in human nature to truck, barter and exchange. In contrast, the American Protectionists saw that there was two causes which gave rise to the division of labour. The first was invention. It was through the process of invention that new instruments and tools came into existence, and this allows for tasks to be subdivided within the economy. The other cause was individual differences. Because individuals have different talents, aptitudes, dispositions, and so forth, they'll seek out tasks that are more congenial to their unique characteristics. I should also note, because of this different understanding of the division of labour, there was also a difference in emphasis. Adam Smith tended to emphasise the division of labour within a firm. This can be seen in his focus on subdividing tasks in a pin factory. In contrast to this minute division of labour within the firm, the American Protectionists placed a lot more emphasis on the division of labour across industries. You even find a change in the vernacular of the American Protectionists. They tended to stop using the term division of labour and they started using the term the diversity of employments. Now, as one would expect, the biggest theoretical divergence between the classicals and protectionists arguably relates to trade theory. And this has a lot to do with their conception of the individual. So we'll first look at the classical treatment of international trade. Now, what you find in classical trade theory is that there's almost unanimous agreement on the benefits of specialisation under free trade. It doesn't matter whether this is the Smithian theory of absolute advantage or the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage. The basic idea remains the same. Now, it's very easy to see how you can jump from a blank slate view of human nature inherent in Smith or the Ricardian treatment of undifferentiated inputs to the idea that nations should specialise in a particular industry or narrow basket of industries under free trade. So David Ricardo argued that under a system of perfectly free commerce, each country naturally devotes its capital and labour to such employments as are most beneficial to each. The pursuit of individual advantage is admirably connected with the universal good of the whole, but using most efficaciously the peculiar powers bestowed by nature, he's talking about natural resources here, it distributes labour most effectively. It is this principle which determines that wine shall be made in France and Portugal, that corn shall be made in America and Poland, and that hardware and other goods should be manufactured in England. Now, you'll notice in this passage that Ricardo states that labour will be distributed to the most efficient area, not because of the individual features of labourers themselves, but on the basis of natural resource endowments. Now, this is a perfectly reasonable conclusion if you assume that everyone is a blank slate or labour is a homogeneous factor of production. It If we assume that everyone is the same, it doesn't really matter if you specialize in just one industry or a narrow basket of industries, because everyone will become accustomed to whatever sort of production the theory of comparative or absolute advantage dictates. There is no natural inclinations for labourers to pursue other pursuits. So this brings us to perhaps the most underappreciated argument presented by Hamilton in the Report on Manufactures. In contrast to the implications of classical trade theory, Hamilton argues, as to furnishing greater scope for the diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from one another, the minds of the strongest and most active powers for their proper object fall below mediocrity and labour without effect, if confined to uncongenial pursuits. It is hence to be inferred that the results of human exertion, he's talking about production, may be immensely increased by diversifying its objects, so diversifying employments and industry. When all the different kinds of industry obtain in a community, each individual can find his proper element and call into activity the whole vigour of his nature. There is a genius in the people of this country, a peculiar aptitude for mechanic improvements. It will operate as a forceful reason for giving opportunities to exercise that species of talent by the propagation of manufactures. So Hamilton, right back in 1791, sees that if you have a diversified economy, this allows individuals to find employments that are best suited to their natural talents, dispositions, and interests, in essence, their individuality. So right away, workers are going to be happier because they can do what they want to do. But equally important, Hamilton notes that specialisation is actually harmful to economic welfare. As he said, there are those with peculiar talents and dispositions which fall below mediocrity if confined to uncongenial pursuits. Now, just to show that this is not an isolated argument, I also have the following quote from Rufus Choate. So in a country of few occupations, employments go down by arbitrary, hereditary and coercive designation without regard to the peculiar characteristics of the individual, but a diversified, advanced and refined mechanical and manufacturing industry cooperating with numerous other employments offers the widest choice. It detects the slightest shades of individuality, quickens into existence and trains into perfection the largest amount and utmost possible variety of mind. I particularly like how he says the slightest shades of individuality. It really drives home the point that in order to have the fullest expression of individuality, economic diversification is required. And these writers argue that in order to diversify your economy, you need to have a broad system of protective tariffs for the development of various kinds of different industries. Now, I think it is important to emphasise that the American protectionists were not in favour of developing manufacturing to the exclusion of other industries. They were, of course, in favour of developing manufacturing, hence why Hamilton called it the Report on Manufactures. But the goal was not to specialise in manufacturing or in a particular manufacturing industry. The goal was diversification. So here we have Andrew White Young, who explains that in every discussion of the subject, it is erroneously assumed by opponents of protection that its object is to promote manufacturing in particular. Protectionists, on the contrary, hold to a community of interests. They believe that the labour of the country should be diversified, that the production of all commodities should be encouraged. The reason for fostering this diversity of human industry are first that all men are not fitted by inclination or natural faculty for the same pursuit. So the emphasis is really on diversification. So you want you want a diversified economy which includes manufacturing, but as well as agriculture and services. So that's the emphasis of their thought. In fact, many of their other arguments, which I don't touch on in today's lecture, was actually for protection was actually exclusively related to agriculture and not manufacturing. So it's kind of a misconception about these guys. And this emphasis on diversification also explains why the American protectionists rejected what would now be known as strategic industrial policy, which is basically, so strategic industrial policy is like funneling resources and funds to a particular sector in the economy. This wasn't the sort of protectionism that the American protectionists endorsed. They favoured a broad system of protective tariffs in order to make the economy as a whole more conducive to entrepreneurship and the cultivation of a wide variety of different economic activities so that individuality can be maximised. So if we go back to the argument presented earlier, the existing literature posits that the American protectionists utilised classical theory but simply arrived at divergent policy conclusions. It's abundantly clear that this isn't true. The American protectionists arrived at divergent policy conclusions precisely because they developed a different theoretical system to the classical economists, which had its own set of axioms and assumptions. And this depiction of mankind as possessing different talents, aptitudes, and dispositions is only one such fundamental difference. There are numerous others outlined in my dissertation. Now, this emphasis on individual differences also informs their conception of economic freedom. Now, as alluded to earlier, the American protectionists supported free markets internally, but within a broader system of protective tariffs. They referred to this kind of economic freedom as industrial freedom, which they like to distinguish from the freedom of trade espoused by the classicals. Now, their conception of economic freedom was still freedom in the sense of negative liberty. By negative liberty, we mean freedom from external restraint and restriction. This includes eliminating barriers to entry, such as those imposed by heavy-handed government regulations in the internal market, but also the elimination of barriers to entry resulting from foreign competition. This is in essence the infant industry argument. So it's a negative freedom in the sense that government isn't actively providing resources and allocating resources. It's merely creating the opportunities for individuals to do for themselves. So this can be distinguished from positive liberty, which is when the government actively allocates resources and sets up industries and those sorts of things. Now, this is a conception of liberty which they shared with the classical economists. The free market is based on the idea of negative liberty. But the American protectionists put a lot more emphasis on freedom of production, what they call industrial freedom, than freedom of exchange. So Calvin Coulton explains that protectionists demand the free and unrestrained use of American capital and labour. It is a misnomer, therefore, to call it a restrictive system when there is no such thing in it. The design and tendency of the American protective system is not to embarrass, but to disembarrass American capital and labour, to rescue and shield them from foreign oppression, to encourage them, to bring them out, and to open the way for the most profitable employment, to make them entirely free. And this conception of economic freedom is informed by their emphasis on individuality. So Van Buren Denslow explains that hence the scene of the greatest diversity of industries is at once that in which industrial freedom rises the highest. So there is this idea that economic freedom entails a diversity of industries and industrial pursuits so that individuals can maximise their individuality. Now, just to reiterate, this is not the state. This is the state creating conditions to make the economy conducive to entrepreneurship and private enterprise. It's not the state actively allocating resources. It's about creating opportunities for individuals to freely enter the industries which they desire to do so. So Robert Ellis Thompson explains that tariff protection does not do anything for individuals or confer personal advantage of any kind on them. It merely creates new industrial conditions which everyone is equally free to take advantage of. By enlarging the number of employments, it also enlarges the range of individual liberty. It gives greatest choice to the fields of labour. It thus helps to develop the individuality in the working class that socialism seeks to destroy. Protectionism leads away from socialism, not towards it. So there is this emphasis on negative liberty there. So even though the classicals and the American protectionists conceive liberty in a negative sense, I mean negative sense in terms of the philosophy, not that it's a bad thing, there is a distinct difference in their conception of economic liberty. The classicals were much more orientated towards freedom of exchange, where the American protectionists were more orientated towards freedom of production. And the emphasis on freedom of production was informed heavily by their emphasis on individual differences. Now, this conception of individual differences possessing unique talents, individuals possessing unique talents, aptitudes, and dispositions informed many other aspects of their thought, ranging from entrepreneurship, the business cycle, and agglomeration. So this is really just an example, a sample of how this concept has influenced other aspects of their thought. I'm happy to elaborate on these other areas in the Q&A, but or any other aspects of my dissertation if you want to ask that, but I might just leave it there for now. Thank you.